Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this hearing. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward, and while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. That quote, of course, was made famous by Apple in the company's 1997 television commercial, Think Different. Nearly 3 months ago, this subcommittee began a series of hearings looking at the reopening of the American frontier. These hearings are, in a way, dedicated to the crazy ones, who not only think differently, but who take risks and are looking to push the human race forward by expanding American commerce and settlement throughout the universe. Our national space program is on the verge of a renaissance. This renaissance is being driven by innovators who don't accept the status quo and who are changing the very nature of spaceflight. This renaissance is also being driven by public-private partnerships between NASA and commercial space companies. In the last few years, we have witnessed the test flights and success of reusable rockets, which will lower the cost for Americans to access space. We've seen the deployment of cube satellites from the International Space Station, which are not only helping maximize the utilization of the International Space Station, but are expanding research opportunities for federal agencies, industry, and even high schools. As our previous hearings have showcased, we also have seen an interest from American companies who are looking to expand a commercial presence to the surface of the moon and beyond. Space exploration is rapidly expanding, and both commercial companies and NASA are complementing one another. A survey by the Department of Commerce found that U.S. companies had $62.9 billion in space-related sales in 2012. While U.S. government programs provided much of this market, about 1/4 of the sales were within the commercial sector. Public-private partnerships have become the backbone of core NASA programs, such as the Commercial Orbiter Transportation Services, the COTS program, and the Commercial Crew program, which will finally end our dependence on Russia to transport American astronauts to and from the International Space Station. However, we shouldn't be content to rest on the laurels of recent success. There's still a lot of work left that needs to be completed to ensure continued U.S. competitiveness in space. Congress needs to work to ensure that investment and innovation within the commercial space sector isn't effectively chilled by obsolete regulations or overly burdensome requirements that may not naturally apply to new business models. We must also continue to challenge NASA and the commercial space community to find new ways to partner to advance our national space policy goals, as Congress will never be able to fully fund every priority within the space community. And in preparation of an expansion of commercial space activity, we will also need to examine orbital debris and how it impacts exploration and space traffic management. There are people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the very nature of space exploration. And if they keep pressing forward, they just might. If there are no objections, I want to enter into the hearing record a statement provided by the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space. And now recognize the committee's ranking member, Senator Ed Markey, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And thank you for this distinguished panel of witnesses. I think it's going to be a great hearing. When President Ulysses S. Grant hammered in the golden spike on the Transcontinental Railroad, he was connecting not only the eastern and western United States, but completing a project made possible by a public-private partnership. We were able to complete this historic achievement of connecting the United States by way of rail by connecting government with private industry. As we now further look towards the stars, we should continue to look to maximize these sorts of collaborative partnerships between government and business. But we need to ensure that these sorts of partnerships continue to benefit both the public and the private partners. So we need to identify the ways in which the public benefits from projects in space, including those projects undertaken by private and commercial entities, will participate. Every day we benefit from the transformational advancements made possible due to space exploration. From GPS to cancer research and everything in between, our activities in space and the knowledge we develop there make life on Earth better. As NASA increasingly turns its gaze further from Earth, we need to ensure that we protect our capabilities to continue to conduct the basic scientific research to conduct in space that has driven so much innovation. The responsibility to continue pursuing science closer to home needs to continue to be mission critical and cannot simply be jettisoned. The International Space Station orbiting the planet is the successful result of partnerships between 15 countries and 5 international space agencies, including NASA. The space station is an example of international cooperation, but also of successful public-private partnerships, which combine the government's ability to invest in infrastructure and basic research with the private sector's ability to innovate and commercialize. The National Laboratory, located on the International Space Station, is managed by the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space, which is tasked with promoting public-private partnerships with the goals of fostering scientific breakthroughs to benefit all of humankind and delivering a commercial return on the investment that the United States has made. This collaboration has made it possible for private entities across the United States to take advantage of this incredibly important laboratory. For example, Visidyne, a company based in Burlington, Massachusetts, has conducted 3 major projects on the International Space Station National Laboratory, developing algorithms and imagery from the station that can better predict tropical cyclones and save lives. This work was only made possible due to the public-private partnerships encouraged as a part of the National Lab. When we pursue these sorts of public-private partnerships in the right way, the public interest will benefit. The Outer Space Treaty states that the use of outer space, quote, should be carried on for the benefit of all peoples. Therefore, we need to make sure that we are continuing to structure our priorities in space to maximize the scientific and other benefits to all people. We should also ensure that our space policies promote the inclusion of small businesses and protect our ability to conduct scientific and nonprofit activities, as well as promoting for-profit activities in the new frontier. The United States continues to be a pioneer in space activities, and our policies should support the continued innovation that has been the key to America's economic success. While space may be the final frontier, this is not the first time that we have looked to innovate by allowing government and industry to partner together. There may not be a golden spike to symbolically connect Earth to space, but the same successful collaboration between governments and business that fueled the achievements of centuries past can drive the innovation in this century and beyond. I look forward to working with this subcommittee and stakeholders to ensure American scientists and American companies continue to be leaders in space. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Would now like to recognize Senator Nelson, the ranking member of the full committee, if he would care to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. And we have an exciting topic here. We are right on the cusp of a major breakthrough and a re-engagement of the American people in America's space program. Now, we have certainly witnessed the gee whiz stuff as we see rovers on Mars. As we understand greater information about the depths of the universe through the Hubble. And next year, we're going to launch the James Webb, which is going to look back in time almost to the beginning of the universe. We set upon, on the manned space program, a new course with the NASA bill back in 2010. It set a dual course. It set one course, the commercial operations as described by my two colleagues, bringing new vitality into the space program with creativity and ingeniousness. And that obviously is paying off in the gee whiz stuff that we see. We set off on the other dual track with getting NASA out of low Earth orbit and exploring the cosmos, deep into the cosmos. And with the goal as set by a president 3 years ago, followed by this president, to go to Mars, followed by another NASA authorization bill that sets that as its course, Mars with human beings, with American boots on the surface of Mars. In the course of that, there's been enormous changes. The very launch pads that were created for the Apollo program to take us to the moon, those launch pads under the able leadership of Bob Cabana have been transformed, one for a commercial operation that can handle all sizes of rockets, the other reconfigured, and one of the things that we got to tend to is to make sure appropriators get us the $600 million requested since this new launch vehicle, the monster rocket, the largest rocket ever, called the SLS, with its spacecraft on top, Orion, it's going to grow over time. It's going to evolve. It's going to get up to where it is launching an unbelievable 260,000 pounds. The space shuttle cargo bay, for example, would carry about 45,000. And so that launch tower has to be capable not for the first of the SLS rockets, which is going to be smaller, but to handle as it evolves. Now we put crew on it in 2021 or 22. And then we start doing the deep space missions and taking up huge components that in lunar orbit will be assembled, and then we will go off with humans to Mars and return. That is an exciting future, and it couldn't be done had we not had the leadership of Bob Cabana, who you will hear from today. It couldn't have been done either if we hadn't had, finally, the U.S. Air Force, NASA, and the FAA all getting in a room and agreeing that we can use all of that unused real estate down there at the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station for a lot of this activity. And now we're going to be, within a year and a half, 2 years, sending Americans on American rockets again. You will see the American public re-engaged like you've never seen once Americans are flying on American rockets again. And that is the excitement of the future. Right now, in the what's called the Operations and Checkout building, named after Neil Armstrong, Bob Cabana took the Vice President of the United States there last week and showed him the spacecraft that is going to go, Orion, on the top of the SLS in about a year and a half, 2 years. And so that's why I say we are right on the cusp. I want to thank General Monteith, the commander, the two-star, that is the commander of the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, because we've never seen the cooperation of the Air Force with NASA and the FAA like we are now seeing. And I'm happy to report in last year's, actually it's this year's defense authorization that you and I have helped Chairman McCain get out, there are provisions that we inserted to improve the launch infrastructure at the range, at the Air Force Eastern Test Range, and to accelerate the Air Force's adaptation to reusable launch vehicles like SpaceX's Falcon 9. And Mr. Ellis, I want to add that I want you to know we have a spot for you at what we generically call the Cape for you to launch your rockets. I'd love for Relativity Space to become a part of the community of the folks as this exciting business is being built there. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to Senator Cruz, Senator Markey for holding this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. And I will note when the Vice President was down in Florida, he promptly reached out and touched the display right next to the Do Not Touch sign. And then he had the presence of mind and quick wit to blame the junior senator from Florida for enticing him to do so.
And thank goodness I wasn't there, or he would have blamed me.
Well, we appreciate this very distinguished panel coming and testifying this morning. We have 5 witnesses. The first is Mr. Jeffrey Manber, who has served as the CEO of Nanoracks since 2009 and is the chairman of the XO Markets Board. He has steered the growth of Nanoracks from a garage space in Webster, Texas, to where Nanoracks is today, a pioneer and leader in the commercial market for low-Earth orbit utilization. Our second witness is Mr. Tim Ellis, who is co-founder and CEO of Relativity, based in Los Angeles, California. Relativity is using 3D printing to build orbital rockets with zero human labor. Prior to Relativity, he worked at Blue Origin as a propulsion development engineer and was involved in the initial development of Blue Origin's BE-4 rocket engine. Mr. Tim Hughes is Senior Vice President of Global Business and Government Affairs at SpaceX. Prior to joining SpaceX, Mr. Hughes served as Majority Counsel to the Committee on Science and Technology in the United States House of Representatives. He was the principal attorney responsible for helping draft and shepherd the passage of groundbreaking commercial human spaceflight legislation, the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004. Dr. Moriba K. Jah is an assistant professor of aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics at the University of Texas at Austin. Hook 'em. Prior to beginning at UT Austin, Dr. Jah was the director of the University of Arizona's Space Object Behavioral Sciences with applications to space domain awareness, space protection, space traffic monitoring, and space debris research. Preceding that, Dr. Jah was the lead for the Air Force Research Laboratory's Advanced Sciences and Technology Research Institute for Astronautics and a principal investigator for Detect, Track, ID, Characterize program at the Air Force Research Laboratory's Space Vehicles Directorate. And finally, Mr. Robert Cabana is a former NASA astronaut, currently serving as director of NASA's John F. Kennedy Space Center in Florida. In his current role, Mr. Cabana manages all NASA facilities and activities at the spaceport, including a team of civil service and contractor employees who operate and support numerous space programs and projects. A veteran of 4 space flights, Mr. Cabana has logged 38 days in space. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Manber, we'll begin with you.
Good. Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Markey, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm delighted to discuss with you today the challenges we face in developing an American-style marketplace in space. Since my last visit before the subcommittee in 2014, my company, Nanoracks, has continued to grow into a commercial space station company. We have taken on dozens of new customers and have brought over 550 research projects to the space station, including over 180 satellites, as you mentioned, all with no direct NASA funding. How is this possible? Through a growing number of public-private partnerships between us and NASA, each one more commercial in nature. Each partnership allows the creativity of the private sector to further utilize the public investments made by you in Congress for the space station. Nanoracks has self-funded over $10 million in hardware to date. Moving forward, we have partnered with Boeing Aerospace, and we are co-investing $15 million to manufacture the world's first commercial space station airlock. We call it the Gateway to Space, to further grow our business. These investments will develop the technical expertise and hardware base to own and operate our own space stations, a realistic goal we've set for ourselves as U.S. policy has matured. But why am I not seeking NASA money up front? Because that's not how the commercial marketplace works. I want to make sure there is no space station gap, just as there was with shuttle on transportation. For a seamless transition, I believe we need the agility of the private sector to be involved. I want to squeeze efficiencies where none existed before, efficiencies in cost, efficiencies in use. This is how you build a customer base, and this is how you expand markets, even in outer space. This is called capitalism. So how best to work with NASA to realize these efficiencies? Or to put it another way, what is the optimal partnership? The short answer is we don't know that answer yet. But the good news is that our partnerships are getting more and more productive, and the proof is our growing customer base. In our partnerships, NASA has always been the safety regulator, the launch provider, and station resource provider. Nanoracks is the designer and developer of the hardware, provides the funding, and builds the customer base. Sometimes NASA is a customer to us at Nanoracks, but there's no guarantee. To my understanding, this is how our partnerships with NASA are unique. No guarantee of NASA use, no pre-operational funding. We invest our own capital and pray there's a market. Okay. More recently, we have agreed to pay the space agency for use of space station resources via pricing discounts and other tangible advantages to the taxpayer. Our station satellite deployment service is a great example. We at Nanoracks were the program originator and the operator. In other words, it was our idea and our capital and our hardware to deploy satellites from the station. NASA provided the existing station resources. The result? Today, we are one of the leading American providers of CubeSat deployment opportunities. We have shown that space station has a unique role in satellite deployment, such as our Stash and Deploy program, where we store satellites on the station for months at a time before timely deployment. You can't do that with a launch vehicle. However, an even larger success is that we, NASA, and Nanoracks have accelerated the growth of the small satellite market on behalf of customers like Spire, Planet Labs, universities, and other agencies of the U.S. government, now using the station for satellite deployment. Better use of station, again, no direct NASA funding. What's next? We are proud to be part of the NASA Next Step program. Specifically, Nanoracks, along with Space Systems Loral, is studying the reuse of upper stages, including that of the ULA Atlas V, for use as a low Earth orbit commercial habitat. This pathway is made possible because of the growing maturity of the partnership between NASA and Nanoracks. Let me add one key point necessary for continued commercial growth, if I may. I respectfully ask that by 2019, we know the end date for station services, whether it's 2024, whether it's 2028. The date, to me, is not as critical as the certainty. This will help us attract investment capital. Additionally, let me compliment this committee's work on the ISS transition plan and specifically addressing this issue in the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017. In summation, we have a range of partnerships today, each with greater commitments by Nanoracks. And I applaud the NASA space station folks for more and more venturing out of their own comfort zone and forging new relationships with companies like Nanoracks. And I thank Congress, and I thank you gentlemen here today for the leadership you've shown on allowing us to go down the commercial pathway. I know we will continue to be successful because creating new markets and tapping the next frontier is what America does best, whether on the Earth or for the benefit of those of us on Earth. I look forward to answering your questions, and please accept my written testimony as part of the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manber. Mr. Ellis.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Markey, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. My name is Tim Ellis. I'm a native of Plano, Texas, and the CEO and co-founder of Relativity. We're a stealth mode startup creating a new launch service for orbital payloads, allowing for enhanced launch certainty at significantly reduced cost. Relativity's rockets are 100% designed, built, and flown in the United States. We are based in Los Angeles with current testing operations in Mississippi, and we are looking to expand operations into Florida, Texas, and beyond. We're a 2016 graduate of the prestigious startup accelerator Y Combinator, whose alumni include Dropbox and Airbnb. We then raised an 8-figure funding round led by top Silicon Valley firm Social Capital. As an entirely privately funded startup, I believe Relativity offers a unique perspective on building a space business. The VC funding model is fantastic for creating innovation in a short time frame. But the reality is that startups often operate on 12 to 24-month do-or-die funding cycles, during which we must hit aggressive growth goals or risk not being able to raise more money to survive. This environment creates both challenges and opportunities for time and capital-intensive efforts like developing space infrastructure. This reality is what led Relativity to first explore public-private partnerships. For the past 10 months, Relativity has worked with NASA Stennis Space Center via a reimbursable Space Act agreement. We are actively testing our liquid oxygen, liquid methane engines with over 6 dozen hot fires in the past 6 months of testing. Due to this partnership with NASA, we were able to spend more of our precious time and investment capital on Relativity's other, never-before-seen technology innovations, rather than commodity infrastructure buildup for engine testing. And as a result, we are a much more attractive opportunity for investors. We believe the U.S. government has an historic opportunity to act as an accelerator for space startups, much like President Eisenhower catalyzed the American automobile industry when he created the interstate highway system. I think progress would be made by addressing the 4 following challenges. First, the current incarnations of the Space Act Agreement and Commercial Space Launch Act Agreement frameworks are not ideal instruments for providing startups access to infrastructure due to their limited applicability and certainty. Relativity proposes a commercial space lease agreement, a new framework similar to SAA or CSLA, but with standardized provisions for greater access to leasing engine test, rocket stage, launch, or satellite development infrastructure at direct cost, much like LC-39A and LC-13 at Kennedy Space Center. Second, currently there are a lack of ideal launch sites in the U.S. for small-class launch vehicles to meet polar, retrograde, and sun-synchronous orbits. Consequently, many small satellite customers look to foreign launches from India, Russia, and Europe. The use of an offshore drone ship launch platform operating under an FAA license could potentially alleviate this problem by allowing for launches in international waters. The concept we envision is more like the reverse of the drone ships and barges SpaceX and Blue Origin pioneered for landing recovered boost stages versus the expensive sea launch platform. Creating an open-access West Coast launch site similar to Kennedy's 39C could be another alternative. Third, for our potential customers, issues such as orbital debris reduction and spectrum rights need to be tackled in a way that do not limit the potential revenues of satellite companies or the launchers that fly them. A large addressable market needs to exist to attract private investment on both sides. Fourth, we also encourage NASA to explore a modulated version of the Venture Class Launch Services program that provides for larger recurring contracts. In closing, Relativity is but one example of the hundreds of dynamic space startups hard at work in suburban garages and repurposed airplane hangars all across America. I believe we are united by a vision for America that is predicated on pushing the limit of what is possible, both in technology and in spirit. We are all convinced that an incredible future waits for us among the stars and that America will lead it. Space is the ultimate stage for exploring our humanity. What could be more human or more American than aspiring to do something in the face of the impossible and succeeding? I thank our team at Relativity for embarking on this journey, and Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Markey, members of the committee, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Mr. Hughes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Markey, Senator Nelson, Senator Gardner, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important hearing. I'm pleased to be here today representing the nearly 6,000 men and women of SpaceX who are working hard every day to provide NASA, the Department of Defense, and our commercial customers with critical launches to space. SpaceX is a firm believer that public-private partnerships between commercial space entities and the government, if carried out with the right structure and the right incentives, are among the best ways to rapidly, safely, and cost-effectively advance America's space program. Before outlining some views on how to best leverage commercial partnerships, I wanted to give the committee a quick update on what's been happening at SpaceX of late. To begin, since the start of the year, we've completed 10 missions, including 3 in just a 12-day period. And these have included landings of our first stage booster, both at land and at sea. In addition to flying our commercial customers, SpaceX is routinely supporting cargo resupply missions to and from the International Space Station. And we have, in a set of historic firsts, successfully launched 2 previously flown boosters for commercial customers. Separately, we're making great progress on a fully reusable next-generation launch system, which will enable large-scale human and cargo transportation to and from the surface of Mars. And most importantly, we are laser-focused on safely and reliably launching astronauts on board our Falcon 9 and Dragon 2 capsule, with this launch to occur next year. This will restore America's human spaceflight capability for the first time since the shuttle retired in 2011. And as noted by the chairman, it will end our nation's reliance on Russia to carry out our own astronauts into space. Mr. Chairman, this is an exciting and dynamic time for space exploration. With new commercial space companies emerging, private capital investment in commercial space ventures surging, and new technologies and competition offering rapid innovation, affordability, and flexibility. Now is the time for the U.S. space enterprise to make maximum use of commercial capabilities. There are a few points to that end that I'd like to make. First, we encourage the committee to look back on the NASA COTS program. It offers important lessons about the utility of public-private partnerships and the right way to carry them out. NASA structured the COTS program very wisely. It shared the risks, the costs, and the rewards of developing new space transportation capabilities. Under the program, NASA provided seed money for the demonstration of private spaceflight capabilities, and it issued payments only after a company met technical or financial performance metrics. By using this approach, NASA was able to leverage its $800 million investment in the program alongside significant commercial investment, and it yielded 2 new U.S. medium-class launch vehicles and 2 new cargo spacecraft. This partnership moved at rapid speed, with the first flight of the Falcon 9 and Dragon to orbit occurring in less than 4 years, and with the first flight of an operational mission to the space station in less than 6 years. The features associated with the COTS program can be more broadly applied now to the development of deep space exploration systems for transportation, habitats, communications, reconnaissance, and resource utilization. In general, they include the use of pay-for-performance, milestone-based structures under firm fixed-price contracts. Contractors should be paid when they deliver, and they should take risk, and they should share risk. Additionally, the government should set high-level requirements, objectives, and goals, but should not dictate how private partners achieve those goals. This encourages fresh thinking and creative problem-solving. Further, competition is critical to the overall success of any such program. Overall, NASA should once again pursue a parallel track with non-traditional partners meant to augment and increase the probability of the long-term success of the nation's space exploration goals. We recommend a new competitive public-private partnership modeled on COTS for deep space exploration. Objectives here could include a sustained lunar presence, a large cargo carriage to Mars, commercial space habitats and way stations to other planets, or a deep space communications program meant to supplement our current capabilities. Regardless, we believe a competitive performance-based partnership program with relatively small investment by the government would yield great results for the nation, along with high-paying jobs and critical national space capabilities. Mr. Chairman, thank you once again for the opportunity to share some thoughts on this topic. I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Dr. Zhao.
Chairman Cruz, Subcommittee Ranking Member, Mr. Markey, and other members, Senator Nelson, thank you very much for having me here today, coming to you from UT Austin. I'd like to speak to you a little bit today about some of the problems that we have in space and why it's critical that we do some problem solving with not just government, but academia and private industry. Right now, the United States Strategic Command maintains a database or a catalog of about 23,000 objects the size of a softball and larger all the way to school bus size. The good news is that they're maintaining this day in and day out and really working hard at it. The bad news is that it's not all the objects in space that can threaten critical space services and capabilities. Before, when space first started with Sputnik, you only had a few objects on orbit, so it wasn't very difficult to know where things were or where things could be. But with 23,000 objects that are being tracked and others that are detected but not tracked for a variety of reasons, it poses a huge problem. The other thing, too, is that we have countries like India. They just broke this record of launching 104 satellites in one foul swoop just a few months ago. They're going to continue to do this and just saturate the orbits with a lot of satellites, which in and of itself isn't a bad thing. We shouldn't be concerned with congestion. We should be concerned with not understanding where these things are going, how they're behaving, so that we can help businesses and commerce thrive. I really like the analogy of the Western frontier of old because that's what space is pretty much today. Basically, you have some folks that are going up there trying to make money. The big bonanza seems to be putting as much on orbit to look down, to track human-based activity or to monitor the Earth. Also, you have OneWeb and SpaceX that are looking to do global internet. These are all great things. But the guidelines that have been put in place to protect that sanctuary, which no longer is quite the sanctuary it was in terms of orbital safety and long-term preservation of space activities, those guidelines are ill-suited because they were based on a paradigm of decades ago, not what we're facing now with all these new launches. And again, the new launches aren't a problem. The problem is that we don't have a space traffic management system to really understand how best to do these things. For instance, all the objects that the US Stratcom tracks, they're all modeled as spheres. How do we regulate spheres? How do we understand which sphere is doing what when? It's very difficult to do. On the roadways, we have guidelines on how to manage the traffic. Things are based on size, how many axles, that sort of thing. Trucks that are carrying hazardous material are treated very differently than Vespa scooters. On maritime, oil tankers are treated very differently than kayaks and canoes. What do we have for space? Nothing. We don't have anything today. And that is a problem. There's a vacuum that needs to be filled, and the United States is in the best position to do that collaboratively between government, academia, and industry. Russia is basically saying that they want to have the UN lead a space traffic management system. That's not a widely adopted viewpoint for a variety of reasons. And so, again, the United States is in a great position to show some leadership and do something about this. Regarding that space traffic management system, what should this space traffic management system do? For sure, it should assure the safety of operations in space, maximize and incentivize commercial opportunities. I hear some people on orbit saying, FCC, please don't grant any more licenses because any single object up here is going to pose this risk of cataclysmic failures and all these things. That's not necessarily the case. We have an unquantified risk because there's so much that we still don't know. There's science that still needs to be done. We also need to provide transparency. US Stratcom is doing the best it can to provide orbital safety products, but they can't disclose where everything is in space for very good reasons. So they shouldn't be asked to do that. And this is a good reason why, again, I agree with General Hyten here, why that should kind of be moved outside of the DoD's purview. A CSTM, a civil space traffic management system, should observe and monitor, track and catalog these objects, and inform the public of where things are at, again, for orbital safety purposes and reasons. And with that, I say thank you again very much for having me here, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Jha. Mr. Cabana.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Markey, Senator Nelson, thank you for this opportunity to appear today to discuss NASA's public-private partnerships enabling commercial space. I submitted a statement for the record, but I've got a few remarks. Since the end of the shuttle program in July of 2011, the Kennedy Space Center has gone through a major transformation, establishing itself as the nation's premier multi-user spaceport, enabling both government and commercial operations to and from low Earth orbit and beyond. This would not have been possible without the authorities granted by law that allowed us to establish the public-private partnerships that have totally reshaped KSC and Florida's Space Coast. And I'd like to thank Senator Nelson for his help in support of this effort. Following the last flight of the space shuttle, KSC performed a thorough evaluation of all its facilities, identifying those necessary to support the Space Launch System in Orion, those that were excess and could support commercial operations, and those that were no longer needed and could be raised, thus reducing our operating costs and becoming more cost-efficient and effective. Using a notice of availability in 2011, KSC went out to the commercial space industry to see who might be interested in operating and maintaining the excess facilities not scheduled for demolition. Working directly with the commercial space industry and in partnership with Space Florida, KSC now has SpaceX, Boeing, and the Air Force all operating from former shuttle facilities. And an exploration park, a research and development park on Kennedy property but outside the secure perimeter, Blue Origin is now building a manufacturing facility approximately half the volume of the vehicle assembly building for their new Glenn rocket, and OneWeb is building a satellite manufacturing facility. These partnerships are not successful just because of the unique facilities made available, but also because of the effort made to allow our commercial partners as much autonomy as possible in their day-to-day operations. Public-private partnerships work. Instead of having these facilities rust away in the salt air, we have enabled a vibrant and diverse commercial government operation on the Space Coast that has already seen 8 successful launches by SpaceX this year. The International Space Station is a unique national laboratory in low Earth orbit that provides a destination for our commercial partners. Orbital ATK and SpaceX for resupply under the Commercial Resupply Contract, and Sierra Nevada Corporation under CRS-2, as well as a destination for the Commercial Crew Program for Boeing and SpaceX, who will be flying crews to the International Space Station on test flights next year. The NASA investment in ground systems to launch deep space exploration systems creates enormous synergies with private investment, leading to our shared future in space. As we move deeper into space with SLS and Orion, NASA is looking to expand our public-private partnerships through Next Space Technologies for Exploration Partnerships 2, or Next Step 2, where in August of last year, 6 companies were selected to develop prototypes or concepts for deep space habitats. Public-private partnerships have worked well at KSC and across the agency. In order for us to be a successful nation, we need both government and commercial space integrated together. KSC is committed to successfully meeting NASA's mission needs and continuing to grow as a multi-user spaceport. In all of human history, only 3 nations have sent humans to space: the United States, Russia, and China. Today at the Kennedy Space Center, there are 4 United States companies building hardware and infrastructure to launch humans to orbit: Blue Origin, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and SpaceX. I think that's pretty darned amazing and something that we can be proud of as a nation. And public-private partnerships have played a key role in making that happen. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Cabana, and thank you to each of you for your testimony. In the last Congress, this committee worked with our counterparts in the House to enact the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. One of the major components of that legislation was the continuation of the regulatory moratorium, preventing the FAA from implementing regulations governing commercial spaceflight that would affect the operations of the cruise transportation capabilities currently under development. While there is a regulatory moratorium right now pertaining to the FAA, this is a question to any of the witnesses, can any of you identify for this committee any regulations that in your judgment are having a negative impact on the industry that Congress should examine?
Yes, thank you. Right now, there's a policy issue that needs to be fixed with regards to commercial companies being able to go up in orbit and provide space situational awareness data to folks. Other countries can do that. We can't yet, and NOAA has to provide basically a waiver for these companies to be able to do that. Unfortunately, there are reasons that some people feel, well, we should really take a look at this to figure out the best way forward, but I think that would be something, a positive thing that could be done is to remove that barrier, because I think that's a severe hindrance in us being able to monitor and understand what's going on in space.
Okay, that's helpful. Anyone else?
With respect to launch and reentry, this is governed by the FAA. And SpaceX, for instance, has 70 launches on manifest. Nearly all of them will be commercially licensed. The cadence and pace with which we are now launching, combined with startup companies and other companies that will be offering launch from the United States very soon, gives rise to concerns that the existing regulatory regime isn't right-sized for this volume of launch. So we want to make sure that the FAA has the right resources to carry out the launches and not be an inhibitor to growth in this business. We also think the time is right for the FAA to go back and scrub the Part 400 regulations that are used for launch and reentry. They were written at a time where the United States might be launching 6 to 8 times a year. They aren't really right-sized at this point for the volume that we're talking about. And here we're talking about things like transitioning from one-off boutique licenses to mission authorizations for missions that look similar in nature, and moving rapidly towards a recognition that the cadence of pace and launch dictates a new approach by the FAA. And this is an area where we think a re-review would be quite helpful.
Now, when you talk about right-sizing, are you focused on dollars and manpower, or do you think there need to be structural changes as well?
Primarily focusing on dollars and manpower, but you know, I think any sort of study on this should look to the way to optimize any structure.
Another significant component of the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act was extending the life of the International Space Station to 2024. It is not clear from a technical perspective when we will reach the end of life of the ISS. However, to ensure that our national space program doesn't face a gap in capability post-ISS, similar to what we are experiencing post-Space Shuttle, the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017 instructed NASA to come up with a plan so that at some point we can have a smooth transition from the ISS to our next capability. To each of the witnesses, in your judgment, what will our national space program look like post-ISS? And do you have any recommendations for what the next major capability should be?
Obviously, I spend little time thinking about that. Thank you, Senator. As we look out in the next decade, we don't think there will ever be a facility in low Earth orbit like the International Space Station. You can tell it was built by governments. I mean, it's just large, it's connected. So if you want to do microgravity research, well, you don't really maybe want visiting astronauts. It's just everything is together in one place. So logically, as you look out, you see a multiplicity of commercial platforms, some unmanned for in-space manufacturing. We're focused on in-space manufacturing deployment. Some will be for professional astronauts, warehouses, fuel depots, stepping stone as we go to deep space. We're looking at supporting ventures like Blue Origin and Orion as they go further out into deep space. We're looking at it with factories and warehouses. So the answer to your question is, I think we're going to see a multiplicity of commercial platforms, less expensive, dedicated to one use, just as you have on the Earth.
Anyone else?
I share the view that low Earth orbit will become a place where there are multiple platforms. There are a number of companies working on really exciting technologies for space habitats, whether in conjunction with the International Space Station, if it goes in the direction of privatization, or independent of the International Space Station. And to Jeffrey's point, this can be viewed as a stair step into deeper space exploration needs. So when we talk about the U.S. enterprise after the International Space Station, I think it's important to think about a sustained human presence out further, whether it's on the moon or Mars. SpaceX's focus, we've made no mistake about it, is focused on Mars. It's really one of the reasons for our being to put human boots on Mars. And NASA's program right now is focused on Mars as well. And we think there are complementary things that could occur to make sure that there's a sustainable presence on Mars long term. For instance, large cargo carriage to Mars, to put the resources in place that would allow a permanent human presence. That's not something that's currently in the trade space, and it might be something that would be really ripe for a prize or for a private-public partnership that sets a high-level requirement against which companies could bid to demonstrate their capability to do that.
Okay, very good. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Cabana, do you believe that there is a risk that we will lose key scientific and research capabilities in space if we largely turn over functions closer to Earth to private companies? What is the balance there to make sure that as a nation we're guaranteed to have access to that
Yes, sir.
knowledge?
Well, I think the International Space Station has proven to be an outstanding test bed in preparing the nation to actually have a permanent presence in low Earth orbit to enable the commercial operations. I agree with the other panel members that have said that, you know, eventually it's NASA's goal to move out of low Earth orbit. We know how to do that, and utilizing the space station as a stepping stone to enable operations to low Earth orbit, I think we will establish the commercial presence to allow NASA to focus on the more challenging mission of exploring beyond our home planet. So I think that as commercial space grows, and it's critical that we have a transition from the International Space Station and low Earth orbit, that we continue to maintain that presence. I think that we will be able to do science in low Earth orbit, and NASA will also participate in that science. It won't be a NASA space station. Hopefully it will be a commercial space station that's up there as we transition, but that doesn't mean that we won't continue to do science in low Earth orbit, participating with our commercial partners. And I think that's where these commercial government, these private-public partnerships are going to be critical to making that happen.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, how do you believe the public would be best served by the National Lab when the International Space Station is retired? Should it be hosted by a new International Space Station, or should it be hosted by a private space station, or should it be a public-private partnership?
Sir, I'm gonna defer on that one to other folks at NASA, and we'll give you a more detailed written statement for the record rather than my opinion.
Anyone out there have a view? Does SpaceX have a view, Mr. Hughes?
I think there's a natural progress for the International Space Station to transition to a private venture. When you look at the overall NASA budget, there's obviously a significant outlay year over year for the International Space Station. And if you want to do bigger things in space, eventually you may transition off the International Space Station into these broader goals. That said, the International Space Station is, as Mr. Cabana indicated, a critical stepping off point for deeper space exploration, and we shouldn't move off it prematurely.
Mr. Cabana.
I'd just like to enforce that point. I think it's critical that we don't end the International Space Station until we have established commercial operations in low Earth orbit, so that right now the space station serves as a critical destination for our commercial partners for both crew and cargo as we develop this capability for commercial entities to operate in low Earth orbit.
And what do you think a reasonable timeframe would be, Mr. Cabana, for NASA reaching a conclusion as to what makes the most sense for the next era?
Well, again, I agree. You know, I support, it's really good that we have till 2024. The space station would be capable of going beyond that. Again, I think it's something that we need to look at in working with Bill Gerstenmaier in NASA headquarters. We'd give you a more detailed answer on that.
Thank you, Mr. Cabana. Mr. Manber.
Yeah, I was, if I may say that, as I said in my remarks, that certainty is very important to us in the private sector. And so it's almost less important to us whether it's 2024 or 2026. As at some point in the next several years, I call for 2019, we say if these conditions are met in the private sector, we can see transitioning from current station services so that we're able to raise the capital and other requirements that are necessary.
So you're saying you don't want the decision in 2024 or 2026, in 2019, everyone can adjust to the
The
new...
decision is announced, and let's say you in Congress task NASA to say, what would be the conditions? We'd like to see that by 2019, where we in the private sector can then begin to prepare and be ready by I think we'll be ready before 2024, but if the station is there to 2026 or 2028, fine, as long as we have certainty.
You agree with that, Mr. Cabana, that the sooner that a kind of a policy can be established, the better it will be for everyone, government and private sector?
I think that it's important to work together with the government, with Congress, and private sector to come up with a date that we want to transition from the space station, but we have to ensure that there is something to transition to.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, Mr. Manber?
Yeah, I would of course agree. I lived through the shuttle gap, and we're all living through it now. And given the foreign interests as well, it's very important that the United States does not give up its role in low Earth orbit.
So are you saying, Mr. Manber, but it's better that we telescope the time frame that it will take for us to reach some certainty, because that plan would then most likely unleash a lot
Yes,
of the
exactly.
innovative capacity which we have. So NASA has a stake as
Yes,
the American,
And I'll say that I've been frankly pleasantly surprised how serious NASA, we interface with the folks at Johnson Space Center, how seriously they are taking this issue. And we're speaking to them monthly about how do you have, let's say, an international space station and also have a commercial platform at the same time? When does NASA give up offering on station certain services if we have a platform and it also offers those services? These are complex issues. We recognize that, and I'm very pleased at how much our NASA colleagues are looking into this. But for us, it's certainty. We need private sector capital, and the first thing they ask us is, when is this, what's the policy here?
Can you explain that to me just a little bit more? You're kind of saying that NASA is like a carnivorous vegetarian. Huh?
I wasn't aware I was doing that.
Well,
Okay.
in a way you were. You were saying, well,
Yes, well-
there's an old song, did you ever have to make up your mind to choose us to one and leave the other behind? Did you ever have to make up your mind? And that's what you're saying, that creates more certainty in the private sector, because they know then what their opportunities are. They can go to the capital markets, and then they can move. So can you just expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, NASA and all the partners on the International Space Station have done a tremendous job of looking at how do you utilize a station, what do we use it for, how do we work together, and now they're looking at how do you involve the private sector. So I give them full credit for this mindset change. But we've also identified at Nanoracks 4 to 6 markets that are not silly markets like branding or advertising, but certain in-space manufacturing and other markets we can't do on the International Space Station. It's holding back the development of in-space resources. It can't be done on the station because it's manned. It can't be done on the station because of certain international requirements. So as we look at further utilization, Clearly, there is a sunset where the station has proven itself. And I mean, my company's revenue is dependent on stations, so don't get me wrong. I'm not being critical, but the station is serving its purpose, and we in the private sector believe in public-private partnerships. We can offer commercial platforms. We just need to know what you folks in Congress want from us.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Dr. Jha, on January 11th, 2007, China launched a ballistic missile from Xichang Space Launch Center that aimed at a non-operative Chinese weather satellite, the Fenyang 1C, completely destroying the satellite. The destruction of the satellite created more than 3,000 pieces of space debris, the largest ever tracked, and much of it is expected to remain in orbit for decades. According to NASA, more than 21,000 orbital debris larger than 10 centimeters are known to exist today. For members of this committee who may not be as familiar with space debris, could you please explain the current state of space debris, how it is impacting space exploration, and what steps Congress should consider taking to address this issue?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So, correct, there's about 21,000 pieces of debris that the U.S. Strategic Command tracks and maintains every day. What are these things? Well, for one thing, most of the things that we launch in space don't come back, and at the end of their lives, it's almost like the car runs out of fuel, it just stops wherever it stops, and then you go get another car, and you jump into that, and then you keep on driving. That's the state of what's going on up there. Now, are there highways in space? Absolutely. There are certain orbital regimes that are being more and more impacted. In fact, thank you, Mr. Cruz, for the example with the Chinese ASAT test. At the sun-synchronous altitude, so there are these kind of Goldilocks places where the gravity field is just right so that certain missions can be enabled for Earth observation, for communication satellites into the geostationary ring. So there's certainly Goldilocks kind of regimes, and sun-synchronous orbital altitudes are becoming more and more congested. Where the Chinese decided to do this was really bad place because it falls into that sun-synchronous orbital regime, a place where other people are trying to put satellites like OneWeb and SpaceX and these sorts of things. And so what it does is two things. One, because we don't really understand the risk and we're not able to track everything, because smaller pieces are very difficult to track. I mean, 1 centimeter diameter pieces can be mission catastrophic, and those are extremely difficult to track. So we detect many things. We can't track everything for a variety of reasons. Certain orbital altitudes are becoming more congested. And again, it's not so much the number of things that we should be concerned about, but it's not being able to predict where these things are going to be from one moment to the next. And you have U.S. Stratcom that are providing these free services to the globe saying, we predict that, you know, at this time, at this place, there's a likelihood of collision of two objects so that operators can try to move out of the way. But how many of those are real? How many of those would actually happen? That's very difficult to calculate. And so that's part of the problem when it comes to the debris is it's increasing, it's not going down, there's no way to clean this stuff up. The European Space Agency has something called Clean Space. They're trying to identify different pieces of debris that they can go and remove, but it's not economically feasible to do that because it costs more to bring something down than to put something up that works. And politically, it's not very feasible because any given nation that has a piece of debris assigned to them, they're the sovereign owners of that piece of garbage. And so it becomes problematic to just go up and clean other people's stuff. So that kind of puts, yeah.
So are there any steps we can take that would be positive in terms of addressing this challenge?
Yeah, sorry about that. So I think positive steps are, one, monitor things more collaboratively. And what do I mean by that? So the U.S. Stratcom has a space surveillance network. It collects these data and it tries to produce orbits for things, but the actual sensor observations aren't shared. They're not shared with other people for very good reasons. Different countries have different sensors, and so everybody has their own eyes, but we don't have all eyes together. And so because we don't share these observations kind of ubiquitously internationally and with other partners, I think the first step is create a data lake where all these observations can come together, expose it to as many people as possible to analyze and just infer things. And through that exercise of the analysis and the inference, I think you're going to end up with a better idea of what's up there and understand that better.
So the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation has licensed 10 spaceports in 7 states since 1996, 2 each in California, Florida, and Texas, and 1 each in Oklahoma, Alaska, New Mexico, and Virginia. I wanted to ask the witnesses, how is NASA working with these spaceports to support or enable its missions, and what could NASA be doing better?
From a NASA point of view, we work, very closely with the Air Force and the FAA at the Kennedy Space Center to make commercial operations a lot easier than they have been in the past. I think we've got a great partnership with the FAA and especially the 45th Space Wing and General Monteith right now as we've worked to make it easier to launch from KSC, what's required for a commercial launch license, how the commercial customers meet that requirement as far as operating, away from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. I'm not familiar with what NASA's doing in direct regards with any other spaceport. Now, we're working with other commercial customers to supply services for NASA, such as Virgin Galactic in the future and so on, and they'll be operating, of course, out in New Mexico. So from that point of view, we work with the commercial customers, not necessarily the spaceports themselves.
Anyone else on this?
Just wanted to echo some things in Mr. Cabana's statement there. First of all, I read his statement with great interest because it's remarkable the transition that Kennedy Space Center has undertaken since shuttle retirement in 2011. Bob and his team have done an amazing job bringing commercial firms to Kennedy and getting us to a place where we can operate effectively. And the cadence of launch that I mentioned earlier that SpaceX is undergoing is a direct tribute to the work that he and his team are doing. So, and that is true relative to the Air Force, the 30th Space Wing and the 45th, General Monteith, Colonel Huff. I think one of our chief concerns relative to the ranges and the spaceports is that there is infrastructure that could probably use modernization. The roads, some of the bridges, the electrical infrastructure at Vandenberg in particular is aging. We've had situations in the past where actually the electricity had gone out prior to a launch. And Senator Nelson's been very active in helping to modernize the infrastructure at the spaceports in order to keep the commercial companies running in conjunction with NASA. I think additional modernization of infrastructure would be quite helpful.
Thank you. Senator Markey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me come back to you, Mr. Manber, if I can. Your initial partnership with NASA involved no funding from the agency to your company, which, when dealing with the government, is quite an innovative approach. And importantly, this meant that Nanoracks assumed most of the risk of the arrangement and could benefit from success but protect taxpayers' dollars because very few of them were exposed. Can you talk about how you see that expanding in the years ahead and what that could mean for, as long as there's an established, understandable policy for, again, a more rapid, innovative era to unfold?
It's a great question, Senator, because there are some things that governments do well, and there are some things that government does not do well. And one of the things that government does well is provide some of the basic infrastructure that the private sector cannot. And just as Mr. Hughes was just alluding to, the infrastructure, the roads, in space we have the space station. and it's a foundation, it's a platform. And what the private sector is doing through companies like mine is we're leveraging that investment that you've made on behalf of the taxpayer. So really moving forward, I see the public-private partnerships of the future being where there are occasions where the government continues to provide an infrastructure. It could be, for example, the lower cost or space transportation that SpaceX and Dream Chaser and Orbital and others will be doing, and leave to the private sector to provide some of the add-on services. It could be, as we've talked about now with Orion, where there's certain basic things that the government is supporting, but the private sector, as I mentioned earlier, provides the fuel depots, the warehouses at our cost, and we look to customers, whether it's in the government or whether it's in the private sector, asteroid mining or whatever it might be. So some of my colleagues talk about this utopian view with less government. I don't see that, and I don't welcome that. We need government, of course, as regulator. We need government as provider of infrastructure. So I think we need to find the right. I mean, look at aviation. I'll leave my expertise for a moment and say, in this country, the government provides the safety officials, the FAA and the air traffic controllers, and the government helps maintain the airports, but the private sector has the plane, sells the tickets, and worries that we get to get home on Thanksgiving, along with the government. So for me, that's a model that may work in space as we move further out, with the government providing the infrastructure and the private sector selling the tickets.
Interesting. Although there are many who want the FAA to be privatized as well.
I said I was leaving my expertise.
No, I appreciate that. It provides this committee.
Yeah.
Mr. Hughes, could you speak to that question of where you see the balance in the future?
Yeah. So as we move into outside of low Earth orbit into deep space exploration, I think that there's obviously a program of record right now that is NASA's central focus for deep space exploration. But I think it can be readily supplemented with public-private partnerships to allow us to sustain a permanent presence in space. So I mentioned earlier the idea of putting forward either prizes or high-level requirements that companies could meet relative to maintaining that human presence. One idea might be for the government to put forward high-level requirements relative to large cargo to Mars, or vertical takeoff and landing demonstrations on the moon, or perhaps even something like establishing a more robust communications network that would enable more rapid and efficient communication to and from Mars.
Do you need a prize to do it, or
you don't
is the reward financially sufficient in order to make sure once the rules are set that it's more like the Oklahoma Sooners and they're just ready to go once they know that what the rules are? So do we really need a prize?
No, I actually don't think a prize is necessarily the right approach. Prize could be one way to pursue it. But actually, I think the preferable approach would be a COTS-like program that I referenced in my testimony, where there would be some element of public-private partnership where high-level requirements are set, companies put their own skin in the game in conjunction with the government, and there's a long-term market against which you work.
Interesting. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you and the ranking member holding this hearing. I think it's we always got to look out to the future and be inspired, and I think that's what we're trying to do here in a lot of ways. I appreciate the witnesses and all your expertise on this important issue. I wanted to ask about, the importance of U.S. FAA licensed spaceports to commercial space launches. In Alaska, we have the Pacific Spaceport Complex in Kodiak. Actually, just yesterday, you may have seen in the news, it conducted a THAAD missile test. It was very successful. And can you give me, from your perspective, what the benefits are from a commercial perspective of having these they go into really one of the topics of the hearing, which is really a public-private partnership approach, a little bit different from, say, the Kennedy Space Center. But just your thoughts on the importance of those kind of space complexes that we have, like, for example, in Kodiak?
Yeah, I can speak to that one. Thank you, Senator Sullivan. So as Dr. Jha pointed out before, there are different types of orbits, and there's kind of a Goldilocks zone that different markets fit into. So for us, especially being a small satellite launch company, and as OneWeb and SpaceX and these companies are making constellations, that having a launch site that is geography dependent to the technical requirements of the customer is very important. So in Alaska, at the Kodiak site you reference, you can reach what's called polar or sun-synchronous orbits.
And it's the only non-government-owned space complex that allows you to do that in the world, correct?
I'm not sure about the world, but in the United States, that is true.
Yeah.
There is also a military missile range in Hawaii, Barking Sands, but they're doing more, missile testing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's just very important that we look at markets and how they're changing and what needs customers have, because right now having a West Coast launch site that is accessible, other than Kodiak, it is a challenge.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on just the those kind of commercial space complexes, space launch complexes, what they can do for our capability?
So it's a little bit different than the spaceport concept. I can speak to SpaceX's experience with launch sites. So we have 2 launch sites at Cape Canaveral and 1 launch site at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and then a private launch site under development in Texas. Our work at Vandenberg at Cape Canaveral has been critical, and we worked hand in glove at the Cape with Mr. Cabana's team to establish processes by which we can provide commercial launch, national security launch, and NASA launch as well. And in the absence of public-private partnerships, like the kind that enabled SpaceX to take on LC-39A, which is our newest launch site, former shuttle site, we would be inhibited from taking on the big manifest that we've acquired. Right now we have 70 launches on manifest. We took more than 50% of the global market last year for commercial satellite launch away from the French and the Russians. And in the absence of our commercial partnerships with NASA at both Kennedy and Vandenberg, we would not be able to service that manifest. So it's quite critical.
Great. Let me broaden the kind of topic here. Did any of you, any of the witnesses see the movie The Martian? So I took one of my daughters to see the movie The Martian, and I'm not a Hollywood movie critic or anything, but when you come out of a movie and your 8th grade daughter says, boy, I need to study math and science more because that looks like that could be a real interesting future. To me, that was pretty inspiring and a pretty good movie. And what do you see we should be doing to try to inspire the next generation of Americans beyond movies like that can get them interested in what this whole hearing is about, which is kind of the future of space, where, in the NASA days and the Apollo space mission days, every young American was inspired. I think we've lost some of that, but we can regain it. You guys are the experts. What do you think, beyond just a good Hollywood movie, we can be doing to inspire the next generation of Americans to do more in math and science and, maybe be on Mars in a couple decades? Yeah, anyone?
Yeah, so thank you, Senator Sullivan. I think first and foremost, one of the things that you mentioned, Apollo and that sort of inspiration, those were days of what I would call real exploration, where we strapped on the idea of taking risk.
Yeah.
I think we've become very risk averse.
And why did we, after the shuttle accidents and things like
that? Yeah, so the thing is that, taxpayers say, I want to know where my dollars are going. I want guaranteed success as much as possible. And when you start levying those requirements of it has to be successful or else, I mean, JPL had a couple of failures as well with Mars when I worked at JPL. And so when you levy that requirement, that really turns into doing the last thing that you did that worked. And that is not really pushing the boundary of exploration. And I think allowing NASA to go back to those days of you're in a risk retirement kind of mentality,
Yeah.
and you know, some bad things are going to happen and some lives are likely to be lost. I think strapping on that idea of risk to get out there and explore, I think that's the thing that will inspire a next generation, is to see bold moves and not just argument upon argument and incremental kind of things, but just bold. We're going to do this and we're committed to it and it's just going to happen.
By the way, the chairman and I are very interested in missile defense, and we hear that a lot from our experts in the missile defense area, that the risk of failure really inhibits us from making significant advances. Anyone else on that question? I know.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, is that all right?
Take your time.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add to that, sir. I think taking risk is important. I just want to take informed risk. I want to understand the risk that I'm taking and mitigate it as best as possible. Our visitor center at the Kennedy Space Center, it's totally run by, there are no appropriated dollars that run it. Last year, we set a record for the number of visitors that we had, 1.6 million, and we're on track to beat that this year. There is great interest in space, and I go over there on a regular basis, and I'll just walk up to kids and ask them, hey, how'd you enjoy your day? And it's the exact right mix of entertainment, but also learning. Yeah. And they are truly inspired when they see what's going on, when they see our history, but they also get a chance to see what our future is. And I think to continue to generate that interest in students today to pursue math and science, we need to continue on the path we're on. We have to continue, you know, having launches at the Cape. I don't care what rocket it is or what's on it. Anytime a rocket ship leaves planet Earth, that is an inspiring experience, and people walk away from it motivated and enthused and wanting to be part of what we're doing. I think we're on the right track. We just need to follow through, continue to build on what we've done, continue to have commercial launches, to have an exploration program for NASA to go beyond planet Earth, to work in partnership with our commercial companies to make that happen. I think we're doing all the right things, and we just got to press ahead. And I want to make, I read the book. The book's a lot better than the movie, but I saw the movie too. I want to make The Martian happen for real.
Yeah.
Everything except that part for the storm.
Right, we don't want to leave
I don't want to leave anybody behind. But
Mars.
that,
Do you have someone in mind you want to leave there?
No, but I volunteer to go. I'm ready. I think we need to continue to pursue this bold path that we're on and continue to have the success that we're having, and that's going to continue to generate this interest in math and science.
Yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, if I may make two quick comments. First is on the risk aspect. One of the toughest things at Nanoracks was getting NASA and the space station program early on to recognize that failure was okay as long as it didn't hurt the safety of the crew. And they were just so focused that we had to build the customer's payload so it would work 100% of the time, but the customer didn't want to pay that cost. And maybe they get 70% of their results as long as it didn't. And today we're at a point with the space station program where they understand failures on the private sector side. If I don't get the hardware to work, my customer doesn't pay me. And so we're reaching a very interesting balance with NASA now. On the education, let me say that one of the biggest surprises for Nanoracks when we started was our early customers were educational schools. And it's gotten to be such a huge program for us that we've created a new company, a public benefits company called Dream Up. And it's separate from us, and we've flown 4 or 5 schools in Texas and Houston. We've flown, I think it's something like 40 high schools. We've flown high schools in Israel, 160 congressional districts of schools with no NASA funding. And some of the parents have bake sales. They get together. They get local, the Subaru dealers gives them sponsorship. And so I can tell you that in the trenches out there, you know, in the small towns, the enthusiasm for space and education and research is huge, and that Dream Up is growing significantly, and it's wonderful, and there's no government funding.
Great, that's great to hear. Anyone else on that important topic?
Yeah, I can speak to it. So as CEO of Relativity, I'm humbled to speak on behalf of all venture-backed startups. And I can definitely tell you, if you're getting venture capital, you do not dream small, you dream big. And you take huge risks, and you're looking for outsized returns. So I think that setting an example myself being a 27-year-old co-founder of a space company that's now tested rocket engines at NASA Stennis Space Center, that I hope to be an inspiration for other people, and that members that join our team at Relativity and all of the other venture-backed startups are able to see that success and having more winners will actually inspire people to go make that reality happen themselves.
Great.
And I'll jump in as well. So SpaceX's goal, stated goal for years now, is to make humanity a multiplanetary species, a rather lofty goal. And it's one that we deeply believe in, and it drives almost every decision that we make within the company. And so I think setting big goals like that is critical. And the way that the government can help to encourage this through public-private partnerships are to set high-level requirements and not tell companies how to complete them, but rather establish the requirements, partner with the companies to get them done, and to get them done in a way that is rapid and efficient, safe and reliable. There are a number of opportunities, I think, that we've got out to the right here to complement our existing program to get to Mars that can rely upon commercial capabilities, set these big goals, let private capital work in conjunction with government money to achieve these goals and get it done in 4 to 8 years.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. And I didn't get a response. Are you a fan of The Martian as well?
I am, although an even more important technological innovation, if any of you could develop a lightsaber, I think that would truly energize interest in space exploration.
Thank you.
I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I think this was a productive hearing, a helpful hearing with a lot of good, positive suggestions that came out of it. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, any senators that have follow-up questions for the record, they're asked to submit them for the record, and upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And with that being said, thank you again. This hearing is adjourned.